There is a particular quality of silence that lives inside stone. Not the silence of an empty room, which always carries the faint suggestion of someone having just left, but the deeper quiet of surfaces that have held the dark for thousands of years. Cool under the fingertips even in summer heat. Faintly rough, faintly damp in the way limestone always is when you press your palm flat against it. There is a smell, too, faint and mineral, somewhere between chalk and rain, that rises from old stone when it is touched, as if the warmth of your hand is enough to wake something in it. You may have felt this once, pressing your hand against the wall of a very old building late at night, or the face of a cliff at the edge of the sea, or even the smooth, worn stone of a church floor beneath bare feet. The stone gives nothing back. It simply holds what it is, patient and indifferent, and yet something in the contact settles you, lowers the breath, draws the mind toward older, quieter things. This is a story about stone, about people who cut it from the bedrock of a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey more than 11,000 years ago, and who shaped it into something so deliberate, so large, and so carefully arranged that it has overturned much of what we thought we knew about what humans were doing and thinking in the earliest chapters of their history. The place is called Göbekli Tepe. The name translates, with no particular grandeur, as Belly Hill in Turkish, because from a distance it looks like a low swelling on an otherwise flat plateau, unremarkable, the kind of hill a person might walk past without pausing. Beneath that swell, buried under millennia of accumulated debris, lay the oldest known monumental architecture in the world. Circular enclosures built of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, carved with animals and abstract symbols, arranged with a care and intention that no one had expected from hunter-gatherers living in what we used to call the Stone Age, living in the years before farming, before pottery, before the wheel, before writing. Before we had assumed almost everything. Let the night settle in around you now. Whatever the day carried, let it rest. There is no urgency in what follows. The oldest stories move slowly. They were never meant to be rushed. Somewhere in southeastern Turkey, on a ridge above a plain that extends to the south and east for as far as the eye can follow, a hill made of human hands and human intention is doing what it has done for 11,000 years. Simply being there. Simply holding the dark. Let it hold some of your dark too for a while, as we travel back to the beginning of something. The region of southeastern Turkey where all of this took place sits at the upper edge of what geographers and historians have long called the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land that runs from the Nile Valley through the Levant and curls around through the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It is a region that has been occupied by humans for an almost incomprehensible length of time, a place where the conditions were right, at various moments in deep prehistory, for the kinds of changes that would eventually transform the whole of human life on Earth. Göbekli Tepe occupies a ridge in the Germuş Mountains, about 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, and it sits at roughly 785 meters above sea level, which makes it the highest point in the surrounding range. From the top of the mound, on a clear day, you can see for extraordinary distances. The Harran Plain extends south toward what is now Syria, flat and pale in the afternoon light, To the northeast on many days, the dark profile of the Karakadeg Mountains hangs on the horizon. The Taurus Mountains rise to the north. In every direction there is a sense of openness, of being at a hinge between the mountains and the lowlands, between one kind of landscape and another. The view matters because it tells you something about why people chose this specific place. A high ridge with wide sightlines over a rich plain is not an accidental location. Whether that choice was driven by practical considerations or by something less easily named, people kept returning to this place for a very long time. The mound itself, the tell as archaeologists call it, is 15 meters high and covers roughly 9 hectares, built up entirely from the accumulated rubble of human activity over at least 15 centuries of intermittent construction and use. But the world that surrounded Göbekli Tepe 11,000 years ago was meaningfully different from the landscape that exists there today. The climate in the early pre-Pottery Neolithic, in those centuries just after the end of the last ice age, was wetter and cooler than it is now. Environmental research suggests the Germuş Mountains and the surrounding region would have supported considerably denser vegetation than the dry, scrubby terrain visible today. There would have been oak and pistachio woodland on the higher slopes, open grassland in the valleys and plains, and along the lower ground, the wild ancestors of several plants that would eventually, in this very region, become the foundation of agriculture. Wild einkorn wheat grew here in abundance. Wild emmer wheat, wild barley, wild lentils. A genetic study published in 1997 traced the domestication of einkorn wheat to a single origin point in the Karakadeg Mountains of southeastern Turkey, the same mountains visible on the horizon from the top of Göbekli Tepe's hill. The grasses that would eventually feed the world grew within sight of these stones. The animals were different too. Gazelle moved through the lowlands in seasonal migrations, in numbers large enough to sustain extended hunts. Aurochs, the enormous wild cattle that are the ancestors of all domestic cattle, browsed along the forest edges. Wild boar rooted through the woodland undergrowth. Fox, crane, vulture, snake, ibis, lion. The Germuş Mountains and the Harran Plain were alive in a way that is difficult to picture now, when the land is largely given over to dry farming, and the wildlife is a fraction of what it once was. The mound of Göbekli Tepe rises from a flat limestone plateau shaped roughly like a star, and the site looks down from every side over the surrounding country. There is an old mulberry tree near one of the excavation areas that marks what became, in later centuries, an Islamic pilgrimage spot, and its presence there is not incidental. This was a place people felt drawn to across many different periods, and for many different reasons. Long before any archaeological work began, local tradition considered the rocky hills sacred in some way, even as the Yildiz family, who owned the land, cultivated the surrounding fields and periodically plowed up fragments of ancient stone without fully knowing what they were turning over. The land itself was trying, in a slow way, to reveal what it contained. To understand the people who built Göbekli Tepe, it helps to hold that older landscape in mind. Not a barren or harsh place. A rich one. A place where people who knew it well could live, not always easily, but well enough, and where the logic of settlement and gathering and collective effort already made a kind of sense long before the first enclosure was ever built. The people who built and used Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, or something close enough to it that the distinction archaeologists have been carefully refining for decades is still not entirely settled. They lived in the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, a period defined essentially by what had not yet arrived. No fired clay vessels, not yet. No domesticated crops grown in prepared fields, not yet, or not reliably. No permanent villages in the sense that would become familiar over the following millennia. And yet the word hunter-gatherer, with all its association of constant movement and subsistence-level survival, does not quite fit either. The evidence at Göbekli Tepe and at related sites nearby suggests people who were more settled, more organized, and more connected across distances than older models of hunter-gatherer life allowed for. They ate gazelle, primarily, hunted in large numbers during the late summer and autumn months when the herds were most accessible. They ate wild boar. They ate the birds that were abundant on the Harran Plain. They gathered and ground wild grains using flat limestone mortars and handstones, producing flour in quantities large enough to feed groups far larger than a single family or band. Grinding stone, mortar, pestle. These are among the most intimate of all prehistoric tools, worn smooth and hollowed by hours of patient repetitive work, and they appear at Göbekli Tepe in the kind of abundance that suggests food production on a communal scale rather than individual household subsistence. Experimental archaeology has shown that a single person using a handstone of the type found at the site could grind roughly 500 grams of einkorn grain in 40 to 60 minutes, producing enough flour in a full working day to feed 5 to 10 people. The grinding would have been heard at some distance, a low, rhythmic scraping that was part of the ordinary background sound of camp life, as unremarkable as breathing, as fundamental as fire. In the evenings, the grinding would have stopped, and the smell of cooked grain would have mixed with smoke and the cool air coming off the plain. They had no metal. Their tools were stone, and the quality of their stonework was remarkable. Flint was knapped into blades precise enough to cut through the hides of large animals and sharp enough to carve. With enough patience and accumulated skill, the detailed bas-reliefs that cover the limestone pillars of the enclosures. They had rope, almost certainly, and wooden sledges or rollers of some kind, and the accumulated engineering knowledge of people who had been moving heavy things, building temporary structures, and managing large cooperative efforts across many generations. They were not simple people, living simple lives on the edge of survival. They were people with sophisticated knowledge of their landscape, complex social arrangements, rich symbolic lives, and the organizational capacity to build things that required hundreds of individuals working together in sustained coordination. What the archaeological record cannot tell us directly, and what is perhaps the most quietly absorbing question the site raises, is what these people were like in the texture of their daily lives, in the small and ordinary moments between the extraordinary acts of construction and ceremony. They would have moved with the seasons to some extent, following the gazelle herds and the ripening of wild grains, camping in lowland shelters during the winter, climbing toward the Germuş ridge in the warmer months. Children would have learned the landscape the way children learn languages, by immersion, by repetition, by watching and copying the adults who already knew which hillside held the best flint, which valley was most likely to hold game in a dry year, which stars marked the time to begin moving south. The stars over this part of Turkey on a clear night are still dense enough, even now, to stop a person mid-step. 11,000 years ago, with no artificial light anywhere on the plain, the sky at night would have been overwhelming, a band of cold fire across the dark that it is hard to fully imagine from within modern life. These were people who had no barrier between themselves and the night sky, who learned the stars the way they learned the animals, as things that had character and movement and meaning, that could be trusted to return in the same patterns, and that signaled, year after year, the arrival of the right season for a particular journey or a particular hunt. The shelters they lived in when they came to the ridge were probably not elaborate. Recent excavation has found traces of smaller, domestic-scale structures at Göbekli Tepe, alongside the great enclosures, rooms of mud and stone where people slept and stored things and lived the ordinary rhythm of days. There would have been animal skins for sleeping, arranged on the bedrock or on low wooden frames. There would have been vessels of clay or woven plant fiber holding grain or dried meat, or the resinous oil of pistachio nuts. Someone would have tended a fire through the night, feeding it small sticks when the embers sank, watching the plain below disappear into darkness, and the plain of stars take its place above. In the morning, the fire would have been used for the first grinding of the day, the low, rhythmic scraping starting before the sun cleared the ridge to the east, before the birds on the Harran Plain had properly decided it was morning. They had beliefs. This we know with reasonable confidence, because the sheer effort of Göbekli Tepe cannot be explained by practical necessity alone. People do not haul 50-ton limestone blocks up a ridge and spend weeks carving foxes and vultures onto them, because they are trying to solve a food storage problem. They do it because something matters to them beyond the immediate demands of survival. What that something was precisely, we can describe only in its outlines. But the outlines are themselves extraordinary. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were built in a roughly circular plan, ranging from about 10 to 30 meters in diameter. At the center of each circle stood two taller T-shaped pillars, the largest of them reaching 5.5 meters in height and weighing as much as 50 tons, facing each other across the interior space. Around the perimeter, set into thick dry stone walls, stood a ring of smaller T-pillars, each one still massive by any ordinary measure, each one carved from the soft limestone bedrock of the plateau using stone hammers and flint blades. Stone benches ran along the interior walls. The floors in the oldest enclosures were made of a polished lime plaster, or sometimes simply the smoothed bedrock itself, terrazzo, a technique that would appear again in very different contexts thousands of years later. The pillars were quarried from the adjacent limestone plateau, from pits cut roughly 100 meters from the hilltop, and moved up the slope by methods that must have required extraordinary coordination. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who devoted much of his career to the site, used comparisons with similar feats from other parts of the world to estimate the scale of effort involved. Moving a single large T-pillar, he calculated, would have required something in the range of 50 to several hundred people working together, depending on the terrain and the specific technique. One historical account from the Indonesian island of Nias described a group of 525 people taking 3 days to move a single megalith of comparable size. Thor Heyerdahl's experiments with the moai of Rapa Nui produced similar ratios. The logistics of feeding and coordinating that many people, repeatedly, over the centuries during which the enclosures were built and rebuilt, suggest a social infrastructure far more complex than a few small nomadic bands wandering independently across the Fertile Crescent. The quarrying itself was patient, physical work of a kind that leaves its mark in the stone. At the edge of the plateau, the unfinished outline of a pillar is still visible in the bedrock, abandoned partway through its cutting, left lying in the rock as though the workers simply walked away one morning and never returned. It is roughly 9 meters long, which would have made it the largest pillar ever erected at the site, and it lies there still, 11,000 years later, a record of interrupted effort and also of intention. Someone planned to cut this stone free and raise it alongside the others. They started. Something prevented them from finishing. The stone stayed where it was, and the world moved on around it. Looking at it, you get a sense of the ordinary reality of the work. People kneeling on limestone with stone hammers, working the rock in the morning before the sun made the exposed plateau too hot, resting in shade during the worst of the midday heat, returning to the work in the late afternoon when the angle of the light changed and the shadows in the cut rock made it easier to see what had been done and what remained. Probably they had names for the particular sounds different stones made when struck. Probably some workers were more skilled than others at reading the grain of the rock, at knowing where to strike and how hard, at keeping the cut clean and true. That kind of knowledge, accumulated across generations and passed on in the doing of it, is as real a form of inheritance as any other. At the center of each completed circle, the 2 tall central pillars were given special treatment. In enclosure D, the 2 central pillars carry, on their narrow sides, carved arms bent at the elbows, and on their front faces, belts and what appear to be loincloths in low relief. This is the detail that has lodged itself in the imagination of almost everyone who studies the site carefully. The T-shaped pillars, which at first might look purely geometric and abstract, are bodies. The crosspiece of the T is a stylized head, the shaft is a torso, and the carved arms and clothing indicate figures that were meant to represent something recognizable, something with a human or human-adjacent form, presiding over whatever happened inside the circle. Schmidt himself believed they were meant to depict supernatural beings or ancestors, perhaps something like the divine statue that would appear in Mesopotamian temples thousands of years later. Other archaeologists have suggested they represent specific individuals, important people in the community's life who were commemorated in stone. Others see them as totemic figures, not individual persons at all, but embodied forces in the world, the kind of presences that animist traditions across human history have found ways to make visible. The answer, if there is a single answer, is still unknown. The pillars are silent in the most complete sense. They have no inscriptions, no captions. They simply stand or lie where they fell and hold their meaning within them. The animal carvings on the pillars and walls are among the most discussed aspects of Göbekli Tepe, and for understandable reasons. The variety is remarkable. Foxes appear repeatedly, carved in high relief on the fronts of central pillars, their bodies long and fluid. Vultures spread their wings across flat surfaces, their necks extended in postures that anyone who has watched a vulture knows immediately. Boars are rendered with tusks and bristling necks. Snakes coil down the sides of pillars, sometimes appearing to move between one carved scene and another. There are cranes, aurochs, gazelle, lion, leopard, ibis, duck, scorpion, spider. The richness of the fauna represented is not random. These are the animals of the specific landscape that surrounded the site, the creatures that filled the hunter's world, and the dreams of people who had spent their lives in intimate contact with the animal kingdom. Each enclosure seems to have had its own particular emphasis. In one, the fox appears again and again. In another, the boar dominates. Enclosure D, which contains the two tallest central pillars, has its own distinctive assembly of carved creatures. Archaeologists have noticed that the animal imagery seems specific to each circular structure, which has suggested the idea that different enclosures might have been associated with different groups or clans, each one gathering in its own dedicated space around its own totemic animals. People who came from different territories, who identified themselves through different animal relationships, might have found their own circle in the complex, their own presiding pillars. Among the most evocative single images at the site is what researchers have called the Vulture Stone, Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, which carries one of the most elaborate carved compositions found anywhere at Göbekli Tepe. A large vulture extends one wing horizontally, as if sheltering or gesturing toward something below it. A headless human figure appears nearby. A scorpion, several other birds, and various abstract symbols fill the surface. What it means, taken as a composition, no one can say with confidence. It may be a narrative of some kind, a scene from a story told and retold in the firelight of the camps on the plain below. It may be a cosmological image, a picture of the sky or the underworld or the border between them. The vulture was a powerful creature in the symbolic world of this entire region for millennia, appearing later at Saddleheruyuk and at Jericho in contexts that suggest associations with death, transformation, and the movement of souls. Whether the same resonance was at work 11,000 years ago at Göbekli Tepe is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But the image itself, dense and strange and clearly made by someone with a fully formed intention, is the kind of thing that stays with a person long after they have looked away from it. The abstract symbols that appear alongside the animals are another layer of mystery. There are H-shapes, C-shapes, networks of geometric lines. Some researchers think they may represent a kind of proto-symbolic vocabulary shared across the communities of the region, since comparable marks appear at other contemporaneous sites in Upper Mesopotamia. Others are more cautious. What is clear is that these symbols were recognized and understood by the people who made and used them, that they carried meaning in some register, that they were not decoration in the arbitrary sense. Someone once looked at a blank surface of limestone and felt that it needed a particular mark in a particular place, and put it there, and everyone who came after knew what it signified. In 2011, what became known as the painted boar statue was uncovered, a carved figure of a wild boar that retained traces of red and black and white pigment. The carvings had been colored. What looks to modern eyes like plain limestone would have looked very different to the people who gathered around it. The animals and the human-like figures rendered in color, vivid against the pale stone, alive in the way that firelight makes still things seem to breathe and shift. 3 partially preserved human skulls were also found at the site, carved and modified after death. Deep grooves had been cut into them using stone tools, running up from the forehead toward the back of the head, and one skull had a small drilled hole near the top through which a cord could be passed, suggesting it was meant to be hung and displayed. The researcher Julia Gresky of the German Archaeological Institute described them as representing an entirely new category of find, one which testifies to the interaction of the living with the dead. Whether these skulls belong to honored ancestors, to enemies, to ritual specialists is unknown. But their careful modification and apparent display speaks to an engagement with death, and with the dead that was neither casual nor incidental, that placed the remains of specific human beings in a deliberate relationship with the living community gathered around the stone pillars. The gatherings that took place at Göbekli Tepe were not, in all probability, permanent affairs. The evidence points to seasonal occupation, to a place that was visited and intensely used at certain times of year, and then largely left. The pattern of animal bones found across the site is one of the main pieces of evidence for this reading. Gazelle dominate the assemblage, and gazelle are migratory animals in this region, present in large numbers only between midsummer and early autumn when their herds moved through the Harran Plain. The implication is that the major gatherings at Göbekli Tepe were timed to coincide with the gazelle migration, when game was most plentiful, and when a large group of people could be fed, without requiring stored food supplies of the kind that would have demanded year-round sedentary infrastructure. The quantities of animal bones are staggering in their scale. Thousands of bones from deer, gazelle, wild boar, and birds have been recovered from the fill and the surrounding areas, representing animals slaughtered and consumed in numbers that go far beyond what a small group could manage or need. These were feasts in the fullest sense. The German Archaeological Institute researchers Jens Natroff and Oliver Dietrich have written about the evidence for what they describe as repetitive communal feasting at the site, feasting events that brought together people from a wide surrounding area, that served as occasions for reinforcing social bonds, for conducting whatever rituals were associated with the enclosures and their presiding stone figures, and for sustaining the cooperative efforts that kept the construction going across generations. There is also the question of what people drank. Research published in the journal Antiquity has noted evidence for the production and consumption of fermented beverages at Göbekli Tepe, alcohol made from wild grain crops of some kind. Large stone vessels found at the site have been interpreted as fermentation or storage containers. The wild einkorn wheat growing on the nearby slopes of the Karakadeg Mountains would have been the raw material. Grinding it into flour was the daily labor of the gatherers. But some portion of it, perhaps, went into vessels where it was mixed with water and left to work in the summer heat, producing something sour and slightly hazy and mildly intoxicating, drunk communally at the gatherings as part of the fabric of the occasion. Picture the scene as best you can, not with the distance of archaeology, but with the immediacy of a human evening. Hundreds of people gathered on and around a limestone ridge at the edge of the Germuş mountains, the plain spreading out below them in the low amber light of a late summer afternoon. The smell of smoke and roasting meat drifting from fires built in the open areas between the enclosures. The sound of stone tools, hammers and chisels working somewhere nearby, the rhythmic knock of flint against limestone, a sound so old it almost has no beginning. Children running on the flat plateau, their feet raising puffs of pale dust. The murmur of many people talking in a language that left no written trace, a language that carried in it the names of every animal on the plain, every useful plant, every spring and valley and ridge in a territory of hundreds of kilometers. Laughter probably. Arguments almost certainly. The low drone of something that might have been singing or chanting, rising from inside one of the circular enclosures as the evening deepened and the first stars emerged over the Harran plain. People had walked days to be here. Archaeologists have estimated that communities traveled from as far as 200 kilometers away to participate in the seasonal gatherings at the site, which means that the route to Göbekli Tepe would have been known across a remarkable stretch of landscape, a trail passed down in the knowledge of many generations, as much a part of the cultural inheritance of these people as any particular belief or craft. Arriving at the ridge after several days of travel, seeing the enclosures emerge from the plateau as you climbed the final slope, the stone pillars standing pale against the sky, that would have been an experience worth the walking. Something about the place pulled at people from a long way off. The social function of all of this was as important as any ritual purpose, perhaps inseparable from it. Researchers who have studied the feasting evidence at Göbekli Tepe have argued that the repeated collective effort of building, maintaining, feeding, and using the site was itself the mechanism by which communities that would otherwise have had little reason to cooperate were drawn together and held in relation to one another. The need to organize food for a gathering of several hundred people, far more than any single band could produce, required networks of exchange and obligation that bound groups across a landscape. The construction of the enclosures required the same thing. The temple, if temple is even the right word, was doing social work of a kind that had lasting consequences. The very act of building it was part of what it meant. Sometime around 8,000 years before the present, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately and carefully filled in. Not destroyed, not abandoned in haste or disaster, but buried. Tons of limestone rubble, flint fragments, and bone were carried to the site and used to pack the interiors of the circular structures until the pillars were submerged, the floors covered, the entire complex entombed in a hill of its own refuse. The T-pillars, which had stood in the open air for centuries and been touched and looked at by thousands of living people, were swallowed by the earth. The hill closed over them and settled into the shape it would hold for the next 10,000 years, until a German archaeologist walked across a farmer's field and noticed the tops of ancient stones just breaking the surface of the ground. The deliberateness of the burial is not in doubt. There is no sign of erosion or gradual silting, no evidence of a slow process of natural accumulation. The fill was deposited quickly, intentionally, as an act in itself. What that act meant to the people who performed it is another question that the stone cannot answer directly. Some archaeologists have interpreted it as a kind of ritual closure, the ending of a cycle, the proper way to complete a relationship with a place that had served its purpose. Others have suggested it was protective, a way of preserving the structures and the carvings against damage or desecration by future groups who might not share the beliefs that had animated the place. Others still read it as an act of transformation, the making of a new landscape from an old one, the burial of one kind of world and the beginning of another. Something was indeed changing in this period. The oldest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, which radiocarbon dating places around 9000 BCE, are the most elaborate in their construction and carving, the largest in scale, the most densely decorated. The later enclosures, which were built on top of the earlier ones over the centuries that followed, are smaller and simpler. Each generation, it seems, built less ambitiously than the one before, as if the energy that had gone into the great circular structures was gradually being redirected. By the time the final burial took place, farming had begun in earnest in this part of Anatolia. The wild einkorn and emmer wheat that had grown on the surrounding slopes were beginning to be cultivated in prepared plots. Animals were being kept rather than purely hunted. People were settling into more permanent villages, building rectangular houses of mud brick and stone, storing grain in sealed containers, organizing their lives around the cycle of the agricultural year rather than the movements of game herds. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the emergence of farming in this region is one of the most discussed questions in Neolithic archaeology. Schmidt himself proposed that the effort required to feed the workers and pilgrims at Göbekli Tepe may have been one of the pressures that drove people to begin cultivating grain more intensively. If you need to feed several hundred people on a ridge in late summer, the wild grasses growing on the nearby slopes are not quite enough, or not reliably enough. The need creates an incentive to plant, to tend, to return to specific places and protect specific plants. The dates of the earliest domesticated einkorn wheat, which can be read in the genetic record of the grain itself, correspond closely with the height of activity at Göbekli Tepe. The gathering for the ritual may have helped produce the crop that made the village possible. The temple may have come before the farm. The sacred may have arrived before the settled. This reverses the standard account, in which agriculture creates surplus, surplus allows specialization, and specialization eventually generates religion and ritual and monument building as products of civilized leisure. At Göbekli Tepe, the sequence seems to run the other way. The belief came first, and everything else followed from the need to sustain it. The burying of the site, then, may have been understood by the people who performed it as a kind of completion rather than an ending. If the great circular enclosures had served as the organizing center of a way of life that was itself changing, if the seasonal pilgrimages were giving way to the more rooted rhythms of the farming village, then perhaps it made sense to acknowledge the transition by returning the old structures to the earth from which they had come. Not with ceremony necessarily, or not with ceremony that left any obvious mark, but with the practical and deliberate act of filling and covering, of making a hill where there had been a hollow, of letting the stone figures sleep under the weight of all that limestone and bone and flint. The hill they made is still there. The mulberry tree still grows near its edge. The Haran Plain still extends south toward Syria. Some things persist without being preserved, simply by being old enough and heavy enough and still. The story of how this place was found in the modern era is quieter than the place itself, and in its own way just as strange. In 1963, researchers from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago conducted a survey of the region and noted an unusual low mound on the limestone plateau northeast of Şanlıurfa. They found scattered limestone slabs on the surface and assumed, not unreasonably, that they were looking at the remains of a Byzantine or Islamic cemetery of no great significance. The survey noted the location and moved on. The mound sat in the field of the Yildiz family, who farmed the land and had, over the years, turned up various stone fragments while plowing, some of which made their way to the local museum in Şanlıurfa. Nothing of what lay beneath was suspected. In October 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was working on other sites in the region, having already spent time at Nevali Sari, a pre-Pottery Neolithic settlement a little further west where T-shaped pillars had been found before the site was flooded by a dam. He had been asking in local villages about hills with unusual concentrations of flint, the characteristic sign of prehistoric occupation. Someone directed him to the Yildiz family's land. Schmidt walked across the plateau, looked at the stones breaking the surface, and recognized immediately what they were. Not gravestones. The tops of buried megaliths. He began excavating the following year, in 1995, and within weeks, the first of the great T-pillars had been lifted back into view, its surface still carrying the carved relief of animals that had been cut into it by hands working in what was now a very remote past. Schmidt devoted the rest of his life to Göbekli Tepe. He described it as the beginning of everything, or close to it, a place where the impulse toward monumental communal construction, toward the organization of shared belief into physical form, could be seen in its earliest expression. He was often photographed on the site in the particular way of people who have found the thing their life was building toward, unguarded in those photographs in a way that formal portraits rarely are, looking at the stones rather than the camera. He lived with the site through the excavation seasons year after year, working with Turkish colleagues and with the German Archaeological Institute, slowly uncovering the scale of what was there. He died in 2014 at the age of 60, having seen only a fraction of what the hill contained. The work continued after him, led by the Turkish prehistorian Necmi Karol, in partnership with Istanbul University, the Şanlıurfa Museum, and the German Archaeological Institute. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe was added to UNESCO's World Heritage List, formally recognized as representing a period in human history of outstanding significance. The UNESCO documentation describes it as one of the first manifestations of human-made monumental architecture, a characterization that the evidence supports with a striking degree of confidence. As of the most recent excavation seasons, approximately 10% of the site has been excavated. Geophysical surveys, which can image the subsurface without disturbing it, have identified at least 20 large enclosures buried in the mound, only 4 or 5 of which have been opened to any significant degree. The surveys suggest that some of the unexcavated enclosures may be even older than those already known, potentially dating to around 10,000 BCE or earlier. Estimates of the time required to fully excavate the site run to 150 years or more, which means that many of the people who will eventually work here have not yet been born. In 2025, excavators working under Carl's direction found a human statue with clearly defined head and torso characteristics, unearthed in the area between 2 of the enclosures, adding another layer to a site that continues to produce things that were not anticipated. The Taş Tepeler project, which means stone hills in Turkish, has expanded the scope of inquiry to include related sites in the surrounding region, among them Gaziantep, where a 2.45-meter human statue with finely detailed facial features was found embedded in a bench, the largest such figure known from this entire period. The picture forming across this landscape is not of a single isolated site, but of a region dense with monumental building and symbolic activity, a cultural world of considerable sophistication spread across the upper Fertile Crescent in the centuries around 9000 BCE. These were not isolated people doing isolated things. They were connected to one another across a wide landscape, sharing symbols and techniques and perhaps beliefs, participating in something that extended well beyond any single ridge or any single circle of stone. The site also reveals, in certain details, the ordinary alongside the extraordinary. The rainwater harvesting system that fed several cisterns carved into the bedrock under the plateau, holding at least 150 cubic meters of water, tells you something practical about long-term planning. The flint tool production area on the western edge of the hill, where fragments of worked limestone occur in unusual concentrations, suggests a dedicated workshop, a place where people sat and shaped stone with the focused attention of craft. The stone benches inside the enclosures were sized for sitting on, which means someone designed them for a body at rest, for a person who would be there for a while. These are not grand gestures. They are the details of a place that was used, really used, by real people who had practical needs and practical solutions. What all of it meant to the people who made it is still a question held mostly in the stone. We can read the bones they left behind and learn what they ate. We can study the wear patterns on their grinding stones and calculate how long it took to produce a day's supply of flour. We can look at the enclosures and count the pillars and estimate the labor required. We can note which animals appear most often in which enclosures and sketch the outlines of a symbolic world in which animals and humans, and perhaps supernatural figures, all occupied positions of meaning relative to one another. But the dreams, the prayers, the the specific words spoken inside the circular enclosures in the presence of the tall stone figures, the particular quality of what it felt like to be a person alive in that world, standing on that ridge in the early morning with the plain spread out below and the sky enormous overhead. All of that is gone. It left no record that we know how to read. And perhaps that is exactly right. Some things are meant to remain at the edge of knowing, present in outline but not in detail, felt rather than fully understood. The stone at Göbekli Tepe is still there, still cool under the hand, still carrying in its mineral weight the accumulated fact of what it once held. The carved fox still runs across the face of its pillar. The vulture still spreads its wing. The two central pillars of enclosure D still stand facing each other across the interior of a circle that was built before the first city, before the first field of cultivated wheat, before any written account of anything. They are still there, and that is in itself an extraordinary thing to hold in mind. There is something settling about the presence of a very old thing in the world, something that persists long past any single human life or memory. Göbekli Tepe has been there, in one form or another, for 11,000 years. The people who built it are gone, their names unknown, their language unrecorded, the specific texture of their beliefs dissolved into the same limestone dust that fills the spaces between the stones. But the intention they put into the work, the organized effort, the hours of patient carving, the communal feasts and the seasonal journeys to that ridge above the plain, all of that shaped something that held, that did not erode or wash away but simply waited, buried under its own hill, until the right person walked across a farmer's field and recognized what the stones were trying to say. The world they inhabited was not smaller than ours, or simpler, or less full of longing and meaning, and the ordinary facts of human life, of cold mornings and warm fires, of children who needed feeding and winter that came too soon and spring that arrived in the grass before it showed anywhere else. They looked at the same night sky we look at, with the same basic eyes, and they saw in it something that compelled them to cut stone and carry it up a hill and arrange it in circles with care and intention. We do not know what they saw, but we know that they looked. Let your breath slow now, and let the stones be stones, ancient and cool and patient in the dark of a Turkish hillside where they have rested for longer than human memory can reach. Let the plain below them be quiet in the way that plains are quiet just before dawn, when the birds have not yet started, and the light has not yet found its angle, and everything is still poised at the edge of beginning. The people who gathered there are resting too, in whatever way that very old things rest. The hill holds them. The night holds them. And now the night holds you too, gently, the way it holds everything without weight, without judgment, simply present, simply dark, simply here. Sleep well.